Hello, everyone, and welcome to Cashflow Unscripted. This is your host, Ankur Bhagiria, and we are back with a new episode in our podcast series. Today, we have a very special guest. It is my pleasure to welcome to the podcast Mr. Subhash Chandra Garg. As a lot of you might be aware, Mr. Garg is a 1983 batch IAS officer from the Rajasthan cadre. He has held multiple senior positions at state, national, and international level. He, of course, has served as an Economic Affairs Secretary and the Finance Secretary of India, and he's also served as an Executive Director in the World Bank. And we're delighted to have Mr. Garg as a mentor and advisor to Cashflow. I would also like to introduce my colleague and co founder at Cashflow, Dushyant Agarwal. Dushyant today will be talking to Mr. Garg on topics relating to economic policy, the recently announced stimulus package by the government, and the role of government and financial institutions in the economic recovery from this COVID 19 pandemic. A very interesting topic, and I'm certain there'll be some fantastic insights that come out of this discussion. Over to you, Dishant.
Thank you, Ankur. It's great to be here. Hello, listeners. We have with us today Mr. Subhash Garg. Welcome, Mr. Garg. Thanks a lot for taking out time to be part of Cashflow Unscripted.
Thank you, Dushyant.
Let me first quickly start by asking you the question, which is potentially the most debated one right now. The lockdown which our country has implemented, is it too harsh? Is the government really going overboard here? And will the potential repercussions from a weaker economy as a result of this lockdown would actually be much more harmful than the lockdown itself?
So, Dushyant, the lockdown which India chose to go for has been assessed globally as one of the most stringent lockdown anywhere in the world. There are different patterns which has been used, but India chose to go for the most severe form of it. The risk of coronavirus is very serious. It's a highly contagious one, which spreads not only in symptomatic conditions but also asymptomatically. And therefore, the policymakers decided that let us go for the ultimate solution, the Brahmastra, so to say, make everyone sort of stay in their homes, not come into contact with each other. And this was hoped that with this, the chain of transmission of virus would be sort of completely stopped, and therefore a short term solution, which may be the harshest, was considered as something which was more advisable than go for other solutions. On the other extreme, as you know, is the Swedish approach where you don't lock down anything, you virtually permit everything to go on. You think that this is the way to develop immunity for humans, that herd immunity kind of thing, and that is the other approach. But we and then there are whole lot of approaches in between. So we did go for a very harsh choice. What this meant was that this had very deep humanitarian as well as economic consequences. You saw all over the country millions of um, people were rendered jobless, they got trapped wherever they were, and this whole migrant issue also came up. People tried to go on foot or otherwise, they got deprived of food and many other things in their lives. So this was a humanitarian sort of consequence of that. For economy, also this had very massive implications. I've said in a number of forums that something close to 70% of the economy got shuttered all across the economic production chain of goods and services, other than the farm and the essential goods and the health sector. These were three main areas which were in a way exempted from the economic lockdown. But all others, whether it is mining, construction, manufacturing, transportation, travel, services, uh, all of those were deeply affected. There, some of these services could be transacted by sitting at home. So some of the e-commerce companies, for essential, some of the banks and others did try to keep up. Stock exchanges operated, and but in value terms, something close to 70% of the economy remained shuttered for about 40 days. Couple of days back, the relaxation started being provided. We now have zoning concept applied over the country. Some things are permitted in green zones, the orange zones. Some Nothing is permitted in containment zones. A lot of restrictions are there on red zones. But the net result is that something close to 50% of the economy is still closed. This has massive consequences for the economy. In my judgment, India would have lost about 10% of the annual output in last 45 days. There are about 10 crore people, more than 10 crore people who have been rendered unemployed. There are about 7 to 7.5 crore businesses, mostly the small and the medium businesses, the micro businesses being the predominantly among them. They're all closed. They are not able to produce goods and services. They don't generate. So I think we have a massive economic crisis. Um, it's very unlikely that India will grow next year. In fact, it's more likely that it might contract by 3 to 5%. So, one of the most stringent lockdown anywhere in the world, with its consequences on economy, which are really harsh. Uh, we might have succeeded in delaying or preventing to some extent the sort of spread of virus, though the way it's now spreading for last 7 to 10 days, it indicates that possibly it was more of a delay rather than avoidance. But that is something which we can always debate. But what is not sort of debatable, what is not disputable, is the serious consequences to the economy, to the labor, to the businesses.
Correct, correct. Absolutely. And I think, as you very rightly put, the amount of impact that this has had on the economy has been massive, right? And the government, bases their think tank and bases their policy, took the decision that this lockdown was needed. But what is also going to be supremely critical now is the role of the government, that it's going to play in bringing this economy back to life. Now, the government initially announced a package and then followed it up with a package of about 20 lakh crore rupees, which seems to be a pretty large one on the face of it. But would love to have your thoughts on this.
The government did announce a very large package which aggregated to something like 21 lakh crore. The number indeed looks very, very large. It comprised of mostly the credit and the liquidity. Over 8 lakh crores was assigned to the RBI liquidity measures. There are several credit measures. MSME is to be given 3 lakh crores of loans additionally, 20% of the normal limits, and several others. There are some liquidity measures like clearance of power sector bills and things like that. The fiscal component, which is the grant and the assistance from the government to the businesses and to the people, that component is very small. Different people have tried to aggregate that. In my judgment, inclusive of even that 27th March package, this component of the fiscal transfers is only about 0.7% of the GDP, roughly about 1.6, 1.5 lakh crores. That is where we are as far as the package is concerned. In terms of helping to the economy, we will have to see what was the issue, what was the problem we were trying to address. The principal problem was that the lockdown affected a lot of businesses. It affected a lot of workers. More than 10 crore workers lost their jobs. Um, about 10% of GDP is lost in the 1.5 months' time. The expectation and the need was that can you provide some support to the businesses, especially the MSMEs, and they're very large amount. As I said, there's very large number, 7 crores of that. They needed to be provided some support. Likewise, these 10 crore workers required some wages support and other things. Unfortunately, none of them really form part of the package which has been announced. So I don't think this would help the economy in a bigger way. The other components, which like creating a fund for agri infrastructure of 1 lakh crore, or measures like providing uh, funds for the micro food parks and things like that. These are little long-term measures, and the track record of the execution of these schemes are not very great to write home about. Another component of the package which was expected to contribute for the economy was the reform package. There's some good elements which have come in the reform package. For example, this privatization of public sector entities, or the opening up of the or the abolition or dilution of the Essential Commodities Act. These are some of the measures which are likely to help the economy, but that would require the government to actually implement them. For example, the Essential Commodities Act. This has been said that except some exceptional situation where controls could be exercised, the control will not be exercised, and the Essential Commodities Act will be diluted. But that is what is precisely the problem. Whenever onions prices rise, the government tend to resort to the ban on exports and things like that. If that is the kind of exceptional situation, then it doesn't make any change. It means the same thing continues. Likewise, for the public sector, if in the struggle to define what is the strategic, for which the government says that it will retain up to 4 units or 4 entities as part of the public sector, and you end up defining or including most of the entities into these strategic entities, then there wouldn't be any real privatization. Is power a strategic sector? Is petroleum products a strategic sector? Or for that matter, even power financing and things like that are as strategic entities. By the way, the banks apparently are not part of this PSB's privatization program. If that remains so, most of the financial sector remains under the control of the government. So, I see potential for reforms working for the betterment of the Indian economy, but those reforms would have to be implemented in its true spirit and content. You can't achieve the reform, the objective of reforming the economy or giving a boost to the economy by only doing a token reform. So I think we will wait for that to see how things come out. On the whole, to my mind, the package has not been able to generate that kind of enthusiasm and that kind of support which the economy needed. Maybe the government would realize this sooner and bring out a more appropriate kind of package.
Understood. You make some very interesting points there. I guess it will still be a little more of wait and watch on this front as to what the government comes back with. What is also going to be interesting and would be good to understand from you is that one aspect, of course, is just about opening of the factories and the workplace so that people are able to work again and the production can start again. But there is also going to be a severe liquidity crunch in the entire supply chain because, as we've seen, some of the larger companies have actually already stopped making payments to their vendors. And going forward, I think once situation starts to ease down, even then, I expect the buyers would essentially want longer credit periods from their suppliers, while the suppliers would actually be looking to cut down those credit periods. So, in this kind of scenario where liquidity is going to be very scarce, banks, I'm guessing, will take much more conservative approach in terms of putting money into the ecosystem. How do you see this scenario being played out in the next 12 months? And what potentially can the government and regulator and the bank really do to help ease this out?
So whenever when you sort of have such a massive disruption in the economic operation, so to say, it changes many things. It brings out risk averseness in the people very much. It makes uh, people distrust others. The credit kind of freezes takes place. So this is a very natural reaction. The self-preservation instincts go up. People would try to protect themselves first, rather than taking care of the person on the other side. They might be, when you become little desperate, they might be resort to sharper practices to somehow get the bargain in your favor than others. So this emanates from that kind of mindset. Now, to bring it into the more specific terms, into the situation of this liquidity and the sort of flow of money payments into the system, let us look at the whole thing from different levels, so to say. One level is what is described as the systemic liquidity in the country. That liquidity is measured by how much the banks in total have in excess or in deficit of what the demand for cash or the reserves they see. uh, what has happened in last 40-45 days, that the banks are actually sitting over much more liquidity than they normally have. This has happened partly because the Reserve Bank tried to inject liquidity with them. A lot of operations, this TLTROs, CRR cut, and other things happened, which place some more cash and liquidity in the hands of the banks. Then the other thing, which partly I hinted earlier, when people like you and me, who have protected salary income, so to say, but are not able to spend on discretionary items, they tend to increase their deposits with banks. So the deposits in the banks are going up, they have more cash, whereas the banks, and which I'll come to it in a little while, bank don't disburse much. The result is that you have a much larger liquidity in the banking system. There are about 8.5 lakh crore of liquidity which the banks have parked with the Reserve Bank. It is unprecedented. This kind of liquidity was not seen even in the demonetization days. There is a massive amount of the money, the cash, the liquidity which the banks have, and since they don't need it, they are putting it with the central bank to earn 3.75%. They would be willing to even park it at 2% in my judgment. So that is the way the system liquidity is in enormous excess. Now the next level of liquidity comes for the relations between the banks and the businesses. The banks lend to the businesses. They have cash, credit, loans, and other kind of accounts. They discount, they bill, they pay for it, etc. They collect payments from them and all. What has happened is that businesses are shuttered, 70% earlier, 50% now, and therefore, since they're not producing and they can't produce, they don't need the money to or the working capital to produce. They don't want to take money to pay their workers because that is a straight loss to them. Despite whatever advice from the government and all, I am quite certain that a lot of these 10 crore or 12 crore workers who are out of the job, they wouldn't be paid. And therefore, in all, the businesses are on two they are they take two kinds of decisions. One, don't borrow, don't take out from your liquid credit lines. And secondly, which you also hinted earlier, that preserve the cash. So some people who have taken the credit from the banks have also not drawn, they have just kept it as a potentially usable lines. And the businesses which have received payments are keeping it with them. The businesses which are to make payment, they're not making payment. So the result of this entire exercise of this behavior and this mindset is that you get to a situation where the credit dispersal in the economy also goes down. The cash becomes somewhat of a king, and businesses tend to hold it. And the final level of liquidity is with the individuals, the people. You saw the currency drawl in the economy has gone up. We recently crossed 25 lakh crores of currency in the system with the people. This is about 8 lakh crores more than what it was at the demonetization time. So we have practically come back to the same level, and now this is in relation to GDP, that we have today perhaps higher uh, cash to GDP ratio or the currency to GDP ratio than it was in the pre-demonetization days. People are holding on to the cash; they need it in case required. But its dispersion or the dispersal is very problematic. uh, the the labor which I spoke, the 10 to 12 crores, has withdrawn probably whatever they could withdraw from their bank accounts or from their Jandhan accounts or wherever they could, and they have also borrowed, but they are running out of cash now. So the tragedies which you saw happening on roads and the in the rail last day for yesterday is all the manifestation of people running out of cash. They want to hold cash, but they don't have. So a segment of the people, and this is the third level. We discussed at the system level, the banks and the businesses level, and the people's level. They have larger cash than the normal 25 lakh crores, but it is dispersed or it is sort of distributed unevenly. It's much more with the what one can call haves than what it is with the have nots, or the large amount of people. 50% of the families of the country probably is very bereft and very short of cash. So I think that is the way the liquidity situation is there. It's unlikely to get normalized soon, and perhaps there is no way in which the Reserve Bank or the banks or the government can do it unless the economy comes back on rail. It restarts, people assume the normal relationship. They assume that they will receive their incomes. The businesses assume that they will get their turnover, they will get their profits and the incomes. So unless that sense of normalcy is registered in the people's mind, I think the liquidity situation would probably work in these three different ways as I tried to describe to you.
It's an interesting dichotomy, so as to say, which is at play, right? At some level, you would expect that because of the COVID and because people, wanting to maintain social distancing, there would actually be potentially a higher adoption of, sort of digital sources of money. But on the other hand, as you rightly said, right, what we are really seeing is people withdrawing money and, maybe just wanting to keep it with themselves, so that they have it available for ready spending, which is as you mentioned, happening. The other interesting point for me to take away, I think from this specific sort of conversation was the amount of liquidity that's really parked with RBI by the banks, right? I mean, this is the time when you really need them to sort of go out and start making funds available for for all the companies out there, right? And especially the MSME sector. There have been a lot of discussions and a lot of announcements by the government and talk around helping the MSMEs of the country. But it's I would suspect that it's actually banks who would have to come out and start lending to them. While, as you rightly said, what has happened is that they've actually become more risk averse, right? And they're keeping money with the RBI. Do you think there can be like a potential solution which the government should like can push to really incentivize the bank to lend more to the MSMEs and make that liquidity problem sort of like solve for it a little bit?
See, we have to understand the mindset and the situation of the in which the banks are currently. We have had enormous amount of non-performing assets in the banking system. We had one of the highest non-performing assets in the world. We also have had a lot of frauds into the banking system. Our fraud to lending ratio, fraud to credit ratio of 2% is the highest in the world. So the banks over last many years, maybe because of the inappropriate lending or phone banking and many other things which people have described, the fact remains that the banks lent inappropriately. Many of their loans turned non-performing, and they are sitting on large non-performing and the cases in the fraud. And if you zero in on the different segments of the credit, there are essentially, let me put it, three segments of the credit in which the banks have made. One is to the farmers, the second one is to the business and industry and the services. That is the second segment. And the third is the retail for the construction of house or for automobiles and whatever. In this, the non-performing loans and the frauds are concentrated in the middle, the industry, businesses, and the services. We have bank credit of something close to about 100 lakh crores in the country. Something close to 60 or 55 lakh crores of credit is towards businesses, the industry, and the 10 lakh crores of non-performing loans are all in this segment. So if you were to work out the ratio of non-performing and the loans in fraud for the businesses is very high, it's 20% or so. Now you come to the current situation. In the current situation, when the businesses are shuttered, when they have lost their revenues, when they have lost their turnover, their profitability is going for a toss, their credit is going to become much worse than what it was earlier. So you had a very vulnerable, very fragile credit to the businesses, and you have that fragile to have become further weaker, so to say. So I don't think you can incentivize the banks to lend to in such situation. The Reserve Bank decided that you provide the moratorium. Banks are happy to provide moratorium because that will keep the facade on that their assets are no more becoming non-performing. You shift it, that non-performing even to a later one. Uh, so I don't think the banks on their own would go for increasing lending. They might in fact become more withdrawn. They might not, they might even raise questions in disbursing the existing lines of credit. And that is where the situation in the normal case looks like going. But you addressed what the government can do to incentivize. That was your question, and this relates to what the banks have also been coming out, and they are asking the government to stand a guarantee that if we provide additional loans and that loan does not get repaid, the government will make good. Right? This is very easy kind of lending in its theoretical construct, that if you have no risk of getting the repayments received or the loans collected, then you don't mind, you can lend because somebody else will pay for it, right? So in this kind of construct they have proposed this. Now for the government to take a decision about extending the guarantees, mind you, government also is run by the civil servants and the officers and the ministers. They also would know that if these loans are not repaid and the government is required to pay for the losses, number one, it will cause a sort of deficit to rise or the government finances to disturb. And second, it would also lead to a lot of people being questioned that why did you agree to extend a guarantee to something, some such loan? You could have seen it earlier, etc., etc. That is why the government is always risk averse in extending guarantees. One scheme was brought by the government last year when they, for the NBFCs, came out with this scheme that all right, you extend the to the MSME the credit, and we will give you a first loss, or we will bear first loss of 10% or something. So they agreed to bear 10% of the loss, and the 90% remains with the banking system. The result was that that facility was also not used. So if you come up with a guarantee program where you are guarding yourself against the potential risk or you are reducing your share, the banker will not agree. If you and if you come up with a very liberal guarantee kind of program, the system will not agree to extend because it will fall back to you on you later on. So I don't see a guarantee based kind of solution to be also of much help or much likelihood. Chances are we will muddle along, very unlikely that the banks will expand credit. The businesses would be sort of driven to some more of the desperation. By the way, you should be aware that 80% of the credit need for the MSMEs are actually met by the informal sector even today. So it's a very difficult situation, I must say. Everybody has to not only watch the interest of the economy, but also of the people who are the instruments of disbursement, etc. And this conflict between watching the larger interests of the economy and also safeguarding your own personal safety, etc., chances are that in this people tend to be more risk averse and more sort of conservative. So I would like these solutions to be working and to work for the benefit of the economy. But I don't see these kind of solutions actually giving much of the credit offtake or much of the liquidity to the businesses.
Understood. Understood. Yeah, very, very well put. I would say there are a lot of opposing forces in play, from each side, and sort of trying to balance all of them sometimes becomes supremely difficult. Fair. Shifting gears a little bit, I think one another interesting or sort of potential repercussion that is happening because of COVID is that people are re-looking at how their global supply chains are working, right? And there has definitely been a lot of negative impact, specifically on China, with countries looking to move out the manufacturing from China, right? How do you see that scenario playing out? Is it more of just a short term phenomena which potentially will fizzle out, or do you think it actually will translate into a more long term initiative, and then can potentially India be one of the beneficiaries of this?
So there is a lot of talk about Chinese production system. There is a lot of discomfort in the world about dealing with China. Though so far, thanks to the emergent kind of health related things, a lot of people have placed orders more with China. India has also placed, so it has not shifted. China has also restarted much of its economy, so it's one economy which is doing production. The estimates are that the China might in 2020 also see a positive growth. But assuming that this intent or this discomfort in the people in the world is something which will translate into real action, which means transfer of production system from China. Incidentally, the trade war was going on between America and China for quite some time. In the trade war, also Americans tried to shift their production or their import. Let us put it this way: that their import they tried to divert away from China, and Americans were very serious about it. There is a study which I saw which brings out that in 2019 or so, about 6% of the American import was shifted from China to other countries. They used to import about 63% of the manufactured goods from China, and this was reduced to something like 55 or 56%. So about 6 odd percent shift actually took place. And much of that went to countries like Vietnam, Bangladesh, Indonesia, and other South Asian countries. India hardly got anything out of that. That is relevant when we consider how, if this kind of further shift takes place, whether we can capitalize. It's an opportunity which we must try to get, and there is a lot of sort of confidence in the democracy of India, in the people, the contract system, and otherwise. It's so the world would love to get the production system or manufacturing shifted from China to India. I understand a lot of Americans are talking to Indian companies and Indian policymakers that they would be interested to shift. The crucial question to my mind would be that uh, can this shift take place, and how can this shift take place, or is it likely to take place? I think there are three major actions which we'll need to take in case we want to see this materialize. One is we will have to address the question of the non-competitiveness of the industry in India. We have done a lot of self goals. We have made our industry non-competitive. We charge very high for power. We our lands for industry are costliest in the world. We have sort of banking credit which comes at so high of rate than anywhere in the world. So we have several sort of non-competitive element or the higher cost and things like that. We we don't allow the labor mobility or labor to be employed in such manner. So as a result, we have a lot of non-competitiveness. So we will have to address that. If we don't address, I don't see we can compete. Example may be very simple. On textile, you can't compete with Bangladesh on machinery, etc. Now you can't compete with Vietnam and others, Japan and Germany, and so things are unlikely to get India's way unless we address the issue of non-competitiveness. That is one thing. Second, we will have to address the question of confidence in ourselves. uh, if you put so much of duties on intermediates and other things, if you want to put so much of barriers for on investments coming from, recently there was a decision to sort of scrutinize every Chinese investment. A lot of Chinese investment coming in our startup system. That startup system is the competition or competitive edge. So all these kind of high tariff regimes, uh, the barriers on investment and things like are are unlikely to make us sort of bring up or create businesses which are globally sort of competitive. So that is the second issue we will have to address, become part of the global value chain, have the tariffs which are normal, allow investments to take place, bring up some of these bargains or the negotiations with RCEP and other things. So I think that is the second thing. And third thing, finally, I think which is very important, we have to get the government out of the industry. There's so much of governmental enterprises. Power sector is making huge amount of losses because of the government ownership. You have MTNL, BSNL, you have Air India. You have so many, and they consume so much of resources of the country. We put in 3 lakh crores of capital in banks, the public sector banks, in last 2 or 3 years. We put another 1 lakh crores of capital in the BSNLs and the Air Indias and all. 4 lakh crore of capital has been put into these loss making, poorly competitive government enterprises. This creates problems for the private sector industry, uh, as the cost of many of these licenses and other things are much different for the government enterprises than others. So I think time has come for us to move away from the governmental enterprises to private enterprises, to make us more competitive. I think if that happens, these three things happen, we can probably get the industry shift to India. If these things don't happen, I'm afraid we will have a lot of talk, but probably much less of the real shift taking place in India.
Understood. Understood. And of course, as you very rightly put, there are a lot of changes which are needed, in the ecosystem as a whole. And I suspect that there will also be a lot of backlash once these changes start to happen. I think recently Uttar Pradesh announced some relaxation in labor laws, and already the jury is out whether those actually were sort of laws were archaic and hence they needed to be trimmed down, and sort of new laws need to come up, or is it really exploitation of laborers which is going to happen because of these sort of laws being taken back. So I guess in the coming months we will potentially see a lot of these changes as well, and which in itself will I guess be fraught with a lot of debate.
See, you don't bring such kind of reforms in turbulent times like this. The labor reforms we have been discussing for many years. You would have probably heard that For last 2 years, the government is also trying to consolidate the labor laws into four different codes, right? And the entire exercise was being done, and no reform was actually built into it. So we have this code. One of that has even been passed by the parliament, has been assented by the president, and the rest are in different stages of that. So the reforms were needed at a time when the reforms were could have been planned. Those were the days. Today, in this turbulent situation, if you try to do this kind of reform, it is going to invite much more backlash. Incidentally, just to put it into a context, we have something close to 100 crore of employable people, the workforce. We have 40 crore people who are actually working or who are working before the this economic lockdown started, right? Of that, only about 1.25 crore, mark my word, only about 1.25% of the total workforce in the country works in this organized industry, to which these labor laws are applicable. And these labor laws are applicable to large industry, bigger industry, where in any case, much of the investment is in technology for substituting the labor. These industries wouldn't employ anyone if they can employ a machine for that, right? And therefore there is a very small participation of labor, and the labor there is much better off. They are in fact the cream of labor into the system. They don't need these labor law protections which have been provided for, and therefore in a normal time, if you do away with this kind of protection, there is no harm, no labor would actually lose. What you need to do is to take care of the remaining labor. That's why in one of the blogs which I recently wrote, I have argued very sort of earnestly that let us start documenting, let us start listing our SMEs where bulk of these people are working. Let us get a database of workers. Let us see how and what kind of help and the protection we can provide for them, not the this entrenched labor which is there in these minuscule, and there are only about 240,000 such factories and the establishment in the country where these 1.25 crore people are employed. This is minuscule, but they grab the attention, they have all the debate, and everybody talks about them. This is not a major area. By suspending these laws, you're not going to get these kind of factories built there. You need to do a little more. How does this SMEs come into operation in your state and all? So I don't see much advantage coming out of this decision to suspend. And what is this suspension? You suspend for some time, but the anybody who is to set up knows that after some time this will come. Do you think that businessmen would be sort of brave enough to put up a factory with large investment on on a assurance which is only a suspension for some time? So I don't think these kind of actions are needed for this time, or they will work.
Understood. Understood. It's very interesting. I think, I think it's really a wait and watch kind of a situation, to see how some of these policies evolve, and how does business really react to it. I think this is the last point, where it would be good to have your perspectives on. We have a lot of listeners who are business leaders, of large corporates, a lot of proprietors also running MSME organizations as part of our listener base. What would your advice be, to them, sort of, how to best navigate the next 12 months or so?
See, I think one first thing which we should take into account is that how would this post coronavirus world would be with or without corona. Uh, we, there is one possibility that corona might disappear or might get a vaccine for this, but a lot of people don't believe in that. More people believe that this would stay on, like other coronavirus, five of that which came before it, and this the humanity would learn to live with it. That is a more predominant, more acceptable view. So let us assume that we would have a world, or a world which would have some corona risk sort of hiding around or coming in the midst of us. So that world would have to be different than what this the world so far has been. I would point two or three major changes which would have to be done, or which businesses may keep in mind. One, there would be much greater opportunity for the businesses where the goods and services can be delivered digitally, not by human contact. So, how do we transform our businesses to be using more of the digital mode of producing and delivering it? I think that the big business or big industry has already internalized uh, and absorbed a lot of IT, a lot of digitization into or digital technologies in their work. But the small businesses and the medium businesses have done much less. They are more dependent on the person to person kind of production of goods and services. The technology has also developed. Part of that we have seen. What we are doing right now also is an application of digital technology. Uh, I'm speaking, you are recording, and then it would be podcasted. So the one thing, how do we make, and incidentally digital technologies would be much cheaper than the physical or the manual technologies. So I think the businesses would need to reconfigure their entire business, building in more of the digital content. That is one thing. Second, I think you would need to keep in mind that there is a risk of corona or COVID 19 remaining in our midst. And therefore, the way of conducting businesses would have to factor in this and design the systems to keep that risk to the minimum. The whole talk about so called safe distancing or physical distancing or social distancing is actually has a lot of implications for the businesses. So if you are in a transportation business, you would have to redesign the architecture or the setup of a bus or taxi or the car or auto in such a way that the contact between the passengers and the drivers and others doesn't take place in that fashion. If you are in travel business for that matter, or you are in entertainment business or in sports business, I think it will have to be seen that the games take place or the entertainment takes place, if it required, in the stadiums and others, but it is delivered, the experience is delivered more digitally. Fortunately, again, the viewing technologies are improving so fast that your spectators can be far away from you, and yet you can probably create the atmosphere there. So these illustrations, and this is also applicable for the good side. So traditional system of delivery of essentials and other things, where our retailers, and there are large businesses, 2 crores plus retailing businesses in the country, uh, they have been doing the business in a certain way. The customers come, sit nearby. I think that again will have to undergo a lot of changes. So the second point, which to my mind, is that we'll have to factor in the corona risk, and and readjust, reconfigure the architecture system of delivery of the businesses. And the third thing which I would say, that the way of doing business, uh, you might get not affected. The capital requirement for creating a physical space might undergo change. The way of availing loans and others from the formal system might undergo change. With again utilizing the digital economy as well as the safe distancing kind of thing, it should be promoted that you can, so you have peer to peer lending kind of system. You can create platforms going forward where loans and the money is delivered, payments are made more. You can think of digital money going forward rather than rupee currency. So I think a lot of businesses reconfiguration will have to be dealt to produce what is required in the post corona world, and to deliver it in a way where the risk of corona is minimized. I think that is a lot of reconfiguration, and it has to be customized for each of the business. And probably, I think one more, the industrial economy, the main advantage was scale. The digital economy, the main advantage is customization. You can use 3D, you can do other technologies to produce customized goods. And customization is more suitable, incidentally, for the small businesses. So I think how do we use these technologies to produce a customized product for consumption by the people may provide a lot of opportunity going forward. So I think that's the way I see it. Obviously, every business or every person or every entrepreneur would have to look at it in their context. But if they keep these things in mind, I think probably in the post-corona world, they would. I'm quite confident that sooner than later, maybe in a year or so, or 2 years, we will be back to our normal level of GDP. We'll produce much more. We will produce differently. That's a. I don't think we should be too much worried about that. It is our innovativeness. It's our ability to marshal the technology for generating goods and services for the production. I think if we do that, we will be better off going forward. Thank you.
Great, great. So I think yeah, my takeaway from that I think is we need to I think have a lot more optimism around the post-corona world. It will definitely require changes,
Right,
but it will also throw up opportunities for I think everyone to capitalize on.
right.
With that, thank you so much, Mr. Gar, for taking out time. This conversation has been super insightful. And I'm sure our listeners would also, would have taken away personally something from this conversation. Thanks again for taking out time.
Thank you, Dushyant. I enjoyed every bit of it. I hope it turns out to be something of a use to your listeners. Thank you and all the best.
Thank you so much, sir. Ankur, back to you.
Thank you, Dushyant. This was a really interesting discussion. I think my couple of takeaways, one, while the stimulus package seems robust on the face of it, fiscal component is only about 0.7% of GDP, as Mr. Garg was pointing out. Some 100 million job losses, 10% of the GDP lost. More needs to be done on that front in terms of support to the MSMEs and to the daily wagers. I think the other was some other good and long overdue elements in the reform package. I think that will certainly now see acceleration, privatization of the PSUs, evolution of the Essential Commodities Act, but it won't be easy in the current environment. I think it all boils down to implementation.
Agreed, Ankur. I think especially the liquidity problem isn't the one that can be solved in the short term, as there are longer running issues which have been made worse by the lockdown. In addition to an immediate stimulus to get businesses running again, I'm hoping we see some structural reforms as well in the near future.
Couldn't agree more. No easy answers, of course. Balancing economic priorities in the midst of an unprecedented health crisis is a tough act. Well, that's all from us here on this episode of Cashflow Unscripted. Thank you all so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, do consider subscribing to us on Spotify or Apple, or we can gently remind you when our next episode is out. You can also write to me at ankur@cashflow.io. That's ANKUR@CASHFLO.io. If you want us to add us to your mailing list, and if you're interested in joining us on the show, do let us know. Drop in a line. Thank you so much. Stay safe and have a good day.